Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 5, the evolution of biodiversity. We are not going to go through all of Chapter 5 because they actually took out natural selection and evolution from the curriculum. And so we're just going to be talking about how adaptations and biodiversity are tied together in our class. So first off, with diversity, what you have to realize is that diversity means variety. So we can look at diversity in several different ways, either diversity of ecosystems, diversity with multiple species, or even diversity within one species. So up here we have a good example of ecosystem biodiversity, where you might have an oceanic ecosystem followed by a shoreline. We know the climate changes as you go up in altitude on a mountain. And then on the other side of the mountain with the rain shadow effect, you might have a very wet kind of tropical environment on the windward side of the mountain, but a very dry, very desert-like ecosystem on the leeward side of the mountain. So we can have a lot of different types of ecosystems, and that's going to support a lot of different types of life. And when we talk about different types of life, really what we're referring to there is species diversity. So one way to look at species diversity is just raw numbers of species, and that's actually species richness. Species richness refers to how many species there are within a particular ecosystem. Now, having a good high diversity is actually a really positive thing, because what that means is that they are quicker to recover from any type of disturbance. If you only have one type of species, say a pine forest, and a pine eating beetle comes through, you're going to have a really hard time recovering that ecosystem. But if you have lots of different types of species of plants, that's going to be able to sustain that ecosystem and sustain the other animals living there. So having a high species diversity is actually a signal of a strong environment. Now within one species, you do need to have genetic diversity. They all can't be the same, because if you have some type of a disease that comes through and everyone responds in the same way, that can easily wipe out a population. So genetic diversity is very key to survival. Remember, we talked about the bell-shaped curve with how people respond to toxins or things in the environment, and that's a really important thing, that we all respond a little bit differently, because that's key for survival of a species. Now, one thing that we might want to take a look at is species richness versus evenness. Now, what I said above was that species richness was the number of species, and it's cut off down here, but I can see that its species evenness is the relative abundance. So I want to show you two pictures. So here's our first habitat. Okay, so we have 100 individuals here, and we have another habitat that is also 100 individuals. But hopefully that you see that these two habitats look and feel different. Now, what's going on here is they have the same number of species, and they actually have the same species richness. They both have 10 species. So in that measurement, they're actually equally diverse. But habitat 1 actually has a high species evenness, that there are 10 of 10 species. So they're evenly spread out and no one species dominates. But in habitat 2, we have 82 elephants and 2 of all the other 9 species. And so that makes a very different picture of this ecosystem. So species evenness is also important to take into consideration to see if there are any species that are dominating a habitat. Sometimes this can happen with an invasive species, or a species that doesn't quite belong there, comes in and might be a really good competitor and can outcompete some of the native species. And that can lead that ecosystem into a very tough spot. So even though the species richness is equivalent, this habitat may not be as healthy. Now, one thing that leads to diversity is adaptations. So all organisms will adapt over time, and if we're talking about a long-term evolution of a species, that is evolution. So long-term adaptations of species, that is evolution. But even in the short-term, species can adapt with changes in behavior. Now, they can't physically change, they can't evolve in a short period of time, but you can change your behavior. So, for instance, if seasons are changing, organisms may be adapted to fly south for the winter. So migration is part of a behavioral adaptation to accommodate changes in the environment. Now, long-term changes would be evolution. So individuals can't evolve, but species can. So that might be one change that happens with a changing environment, but on the longer term scale. Now, we've talked a lot this year about categories of critters that we call generalists or specialists. Now, the ones that can adapt quickly and withstand changes are our generalists. They have a higher ability to live in a wide range of either temperatures or pH or food availability. So our generalists are going to be a little bit more competitive in the long-term survival. Now, specialists, those would be things like pandas that might only eat one type of food. And those critters are going to be at risk of extinction when something happens to their food sources. So if you are a specialist species, then you're not going to be very easily, you're going to be greatly impacted by changing in environments. Now, one thing that we do know is that gradual changes are much easier to adapt to. And that's one of the problems we're seeing now with climate change, that the change is so sudden that our animals, our plants are really having trouble adapting to that change. They're not able to have natural selection take place where the ones that are able to withstand these changes can survive and reproduce fast enough to keep pace with the changing climate. So when there are sudden changes, a lot of times in particular our specialists will either need to move to a different environment or they will die, and in some extreme cases will go extinct. Now, evolution is that long-term scale, and I do just want to touch base on this. I know you guys have talked about evolution in biology, but for some it's been a long time. So there are different mechanisms that drive evolution. Mutation is one. So here in mutation, it's a random change in your genetic code. Mutations often have a bad connotation, but they're not necessarily bad. Some mutations can be beneficial, and those will survive and reproduce and carry on within the population. So here we just have a random black mouse in this population of white mice. And because that mutation is not harmful, it allows them to survive and reproduce, and you start to see that change in the population over time. But do note that this is multiple generations. You're not going to just change your fur color because all of a sudden that's advantageous. So the others, so this is a random change. The other three, genetic drift, bottleneck effect, and founder effect, these are all random cases. So if you take a look at this population of mice, in a large population, you have a distribution of white and black mice. And over time, that ratio stays the same. Statistically, it stays the same. But if you have a smaller population, a subset of this population, that might skew your overall turn. So if you have a smaller population here, the ratio could get thrown off in the first generation, and then it may never come back. So if you have a recessive trait that is making this mouse have black fur, and it does not reproduce with the others in its group, then that recessive trait will get removed from the population. So that is a random sampling that they just didn't reproduce with our white mice. Now, bottleneck and founder effect are very, very similar. It's just what episode prompted them. So a bottleneck effect would have an effect on a population. So you can see here that there are white, black, and brown mice. And there could be some type of large event that killed off a majority of the mice, and it just happened that only black and brown mice survived. So what that means is the white mice are no longer adding their genes to the gene pool, and so they have been essentially selected out. And so a bottleneck effect occurs when you have an unusual event that only a small subset of the survivors are able to reproduce, and you get a very different looking population than you started with. And the founder effect is very similar, except rather than an event that kills off a majority of the mice, you have a small subset that leaves to join another area. And so when you have that small subset, the white and black mice, in the new population, you're not going to have any of the browns. So it's a random happening that these 4 mice are the ones that went off to a new habitat, and those are the ones that were able to start to repopulate a new area. So evolution can affect diversity because the new changes that occur might start to form new species. So if these populations are separated long enough, they might start to form their own species where different traits become dominant. So the things that affect the rate of evolution, one is environmental change. So like we said here, a slowly changing environment will give species more time to adapt to the changes. So what this red line is telling us is that if the rate of environmental change is slow, then you're going to have more evolution. And if the rate of the environmental change is fast, you're going to have less of evolution that can occur. Now with genetic variation, if there's less genetic variation, that means there's less chance for the species to adapt to changing conditions. So remember, early on we said that we have to have a variety of genetic responses. So if there is less genetic variation, there's going to be less chance of evolution because there's nothing to adapt to. The more genetic variation that you have, the more evolution that you're going to be able to have take hold. Now, population size, you actually see a beneficial mutation spread more rapidly in a small population, because in a large population it can get diluted. So evolution can occur more rapidly in a small population because you have more chances of that beneficial mutation popping up. So here, if our population size is large, you have less chance of evolution. And if your population size is small, you have a greater chance of that mutation taking hold. And then finally, generation time, whether it's long or short, has an impact. Remember, we talked about this with pesticides, that insects, because they can reproduce so rapidly, they can evolve genetic resistance to pesticides very quickly. So if their generation time is short, they have a greater chance of evolving, and if their generation time is long, they have a lesser chance. So if you reproduce very quickly, you have a better chance of evolving on a quicker scale. So that is actually it for Chapter 5 in evolution. So just answer the few questions below and let me know if you have any questions about this later.